And today is part one, focusing on maintaining animal energy levels and managing pasture for nutrition and economics. We're joined today by Nick Mitten of Purdue University and Ted Krauskopf, a grazer near St. Louis. Originally from Southwestern Illinois, Dr. Nick Mitten earned his bachelor's degree in animal science and a master's and PhD in ruminant nutrition from the University of Missouri. Nick has worked with Purdue for the last 5 years as a beef systems specialist, where his interest, knowledge, and passion for forage production, extending the grazing system, and optimizing grazing efficiency continues to grow. Ted has been rotational grazing on at least a portion of his land since the 1990s. In 2007, he expanded and improved his pasture through an EQIP grant and was able to stockpile forage for his cow-calf herd to graze in the winter. Nick and Ted will share their knowledge and experiences associated with managing and maintaining animal energy levels year-round for nutrition and economics in a joint presentation, followed by a moderated question and answer session as we progress through today's talk. You feel free to drop your questions into the chat and we'll get them answered, or if you feel more comfortable raising your hand, we can also answer questions that way as well. With that being said, I will turn it over to Nick and he can get started on his presentation and initial thoughts.
All right. Thanks, Nicole. Appreciate the introduction and glad to be here today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen real quick. And so, Nicole, can you give me a thumbs up if you can see the PowerPoint? Okay. All right. So anytime that we're talking about nutrition in livestock, especially when it pertains to ruminants, it can get pretty complex pretty quick, right? And I guess my years since here at Purdue, sometimes we can overthink things as it pertains to talking about nutrition. And really, there's some key concepts when we're talking about grazing livestock, and one of that is intake potential and the digestibility of the forages that we're grazing, right, in terms of meeting the needs of the livestock. And so the graph here has been around for several years, and nothing has changed essentially in terms of maintaining the plant in a vegetative state or increasing leaf versus stem ratio is a positive in terms of supplying more digestible nutrients to our livestock, right? And so as this graph shows, as the plant goes from a vegetative state to a mature state, we increase the height, right? And we're increasing that stem to leaf ratio. The challenges with that is as the plant matures and we have more lignification of that stem, right? And so that counteracts supplying nutrients to the animals because the rumen microbes can't break down that lignin. And so when we're talking about grazing, you kind of have to, depend upon the type of livestock or where they're at in maturity, you have to keep that in mind in terms of getting the most out of your stockpile. So in terms of assessing this, again, we can click through a couple of these. We can take forage samples, and I think we're going to talk about a little bit about how Ted has tried to account for the nutrient content of the stockpile forages. And honestly, folks, I think some of the best tools that we can use is our eyes, and allow the cows or the sheep or the goats to tell us give us an indication that what we're providing them from a grazing aspect is meeting their requirements. And so keeping in mind what the manure looks like. Is it loose? Does it really have any type of form to it? Indicating that it's, we might be oversupplying protein or we're not supplying enough dry matter is one component. Whereas if we're probably in the general area where we need to be, that pile has some consistency to it, no stacking. is a pretty darn useful tool. And anytime I'm out in the pasture, I'm looking at cow pies and assessing, okay, this is kind of where we're at. In combination with that body condition score in cows or ewes or nannies, it is really useful. And so a lot of my grazing experience comes from working with Jason Tower at the Southern Indiana Purdue Ag Center. And so we work real hard on an annual basis to score body condition scores cows every month. Now that might be a little excessive, where that's in combination with the ongoing systems project. However, keeping track, and I mean, yeah, you can visualize it. I would encourage you to just make a simple chart when you're out in the pasture and write that down and see how cows might be changing. You know, y'all might have better memories than I do. But it's hard for me to kind of remember where she was at a month ago or not. And we maybe in terms of when the cow is she's maintaining her body condition in an acceptable body condition, or like I said, use over the course of a year or the course of the grazing system, kind of regardless of what that nutrient analysis might have, if we're taking samples, is going to tell us that that animal is adapted to our environment, right? Or what we're providing to them. And if performance is decreasing, whether that's body weight gain or body condition score, then we need to try to work at, all right, what do we need to change from our forage basis? So I don't know, Ted, what am I off base on anything that I've said to this point?
No, it all makes sense. And that manure path that you said kind of looked the way you want it to look. I'm on the same page with you on that. I watched that pretty close, along with the cow condition, especially in the stockpile. I don't really know. One of my questions for you was how best to sample that stockpile forage to try to get an idea ahead of time what you're working with. And I tried to sample some with just clipping it off like you would a regular forage sample, only to find out that that's not how the cows graze when I look at it, because it came back calling for a whole lot of supplement that wasn't really needed. So I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah, and so I think there's a couple different ways from what or methods in terms of how you're going out and collecting that sample. What you described, I don't think was wrong. I think that kind of goes along with, and when we're talking about a cow herd, whether it's a cow herd that someone might be bringing you in your custom grazing or your own cow herd, when over the course of the time, if it's saying you need to supplement, but it's like, well, my cows are my production goals are being met, whether that's weight or body condition score of the cow, I would argue that that's where we tweak the nutrient analysis, because your cows you've selected for, you've selected for an animal that can perform in your environment.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you keep track of that nutrient analysis over the course of a grazing system, and hopefully from year to year, when you get that analysis back, you can, with your library that you built, you can tweak where you need to. And it's probably not as clear cut as what folks are looking for today, but it really does come back to building that library on your own respective herds in terms of having success, in my opinion, with grazing or any other operation. For an example, the other week I had a producer in here wanting some guidance on some supplementation. Now he's not really a grazer at this point, but the formulation software program is coming up deficient. He's like, well, I've gotten along fine the past several years, and this is a gentleman who's been in the business couple decades. And so I was like, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that you're wrong, because you've been successful for several years. So that's where I said, let's see where you're at, and once we have that baseline, then we can adjust from there as we go forward. So I think, like in your case, I would just keep track of those nutrient analysis. and over the course of time, kind of figure out where your herd or your animals are lying. And then you know that even though it looks kind of wonky at first, over time it probably makes some sense. Does that kind of get to does that clear things up a little bit, or?
Yeah, it does. When you were talking about the analysis that way, it made me think about my experience with taking Brix readings, because they're just literally a snapshot at that moment of that forage. And I have really gotten some confusing, results back on the Brix tests. And at the same time, the more you take and the more I always note the ambient temperature and the time of day and stuff when I take it in the sunshine or partly cloudy or whatever. And the more data you get, the more it does come together and make sense. But at first it's confusing. And so what you're telling me with this is I probably should be sampling more. Although what I'm doing now, I have switched from cow-calf herd to custom grazing, developing heifers.
Mhm.
And so I'm not even doing any winter stockpile. I don't have cattle when I don't have grass. And so we're not trying for a maximum gain. We just want to keep them gaining, keep them growing well and improving. But I'm not, it's kind of easy grazing because I'm not trying to really get the most out of the pasture every day. With respect to the animal, I'm using the cattle more to manage the pasture than the other way around.
Yeah, I think that's probably the way honestly, I think that's probably the way more folks should probably look at it, as the ruminant is we're forage farmers first, and we're utilizing those animals as our harvesters, right? And why you don't have them maybe throughout a longer part of the winter, the more days that you can keep them there at your place grazing, then that's fewer days that owner has to maybe have them on stored feed. At the end of the day, you're still having probably a net positive for that producer, because you're reducing that development cost by keeping them grazing longer. And I think that the data is very solid that stockpiled forages, the longer we can keep them utilizing stockpiled forages further into the winter, is going to reduce winter feed costs. I think several universities have proved that. So now it's, maybe diversifying that and figuring out how diversifying those stockpiles or stockpiled forage to keep them grazing longer. In terms of the question on the Brix measurements, honestly, I don't have a great deal of experience there with that, but in reading that, what you just described is pretty well spot on. I think Dr. Woody Lane wrote up a real nice article kind of going through those Brix measurements in Progressive Forage Grower. I don't know if I didn't save the link, but you can, I don't know, did you see that? Or do you read the Progressive Forage Grower at all?
I don't think I get it sometimes. I don't think I get every issue. I'm not sure. I get a forage magazine, but it's not, I don't think it's the same one you're referencing.
Okay. So I can send that to Nicole afterwards, and she can maybe share that with everybody. But
Okay.
what you, like you said, kind of the measurements weren't stacking up, and that's because while it does a good job of assessing soluble sugars in plant material, there's also some other components that can be in that measurement. So you have soluble sugars, you can also have starch, you can have other components of protein and some salts. And so, like you said, depending upon the time of the day and your forage species, that kind of contributes to some analysis that don't make a lot of sense. But what you're doing in terms of keeping track of the temperature, the time of the day, I would encourage others that they need to do the same thing, and then over time average those out, and that's going to make more sense. But like you said, it's going to take more sampling and more record keeping to really get the most benefit out of using that tool. I myself and more in favor of sampling forage, like you said you were, taking clippings. But when you're taking those clippings, I think it's important to take clippings of the height that you're going to be managing those livestock, right? If you're going to maintain a residual of between 4 inches to maybe 6 inches, that's where you need to maintain that residual when you're taking those pasture clippings. Otherwise, you're going to, if you're taking it all the way down to the ground, that's not indicative of what the livestock are actually grazing. And if you look at some videos online, they're going to be taking it. Some of them are taking them pretty close. And then sending that analysis off and looking at your acid detergent fiber, your neutral detergent fiber, so your acid detergent fiber is going to be your indicator of digestibility. Neutral detergent fiber is your intake potential, and that has a lot of merit there. Pay attention to that NDF value, and then your energy values such as TDN, total digestible nutrients, or get into megacalories in addition to crude protein. I'm going to say that in the Midwest, more than likely grazing, tall fescue or some other cool season forages, protein's most of the time not going to be the limiting nutrient. It's going to be energy. Along the same lines, if you're taking those forage analysis, I would go ahead and spend a couple extra dollars and do a wet chemistry, unless the lab has a really good library for near infrared spectro NIR. I always stumble on that third word, because the NIR analysis, it's accurate, but it's dependent upon that library. And so if they don't have a real lengthy library for your pasture systems, then it may not be as accurate. I ran into that with some other feed ingredients in the past. So that's kind of where I would go along the lines there.
The lab or the company I was using for the analysis, the guy I was dealing with, their customers are a lot of dairy customers. And so could you explain a little better about the difference between relative feed value and relative forage quality? Because it sounds like with pasture, I want the relative forage quality to carry more weight, or would be more accurate versus the other. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah. The relative forage quality versus the value. If I'm remembering correctly, the forage quality takes into more account the actual digestibility of that forage, where the forage value is lacking. And that's we host a forage contest here in the state. We've kind of borrowed that idea from other states to really encourage folks to be sampling their forages. And we use relative forage quality as kind of our baseline in terms of assessing, ranking hay. And then we go break it out further into TDN and crude protein. So at the same time, there's not a nutrient requirement for relative forage quality. And so I think it's a fine value to use as, I guess, a marketing component of that forage. But the NDF neutral detergent fiber is a big component, because that's telling you how much they can actually consume. And so I'm trying to figure out I don't know if I can address that very well in terms of a grazing component. Never thought about it that way, or thought about it in enough detail. That's because if we're thinking about assessing, tying relative forage quality to a manure pile out in the pasture, I'd have to kind of wrap my head around that a little bit. But so that's probably not answering your question all that well.
What was mentioned to me was that those guys were primarily interested in analysis on alfalfa hay, and that's not what I had, and
Sure.
That's not what we were sending in to be sampled or to be analyzed.
Sure. Yeah, but relative forage quality, in the forage marketing world, even as it pertains to while it's based off kind of standardized off of alfalfa in terms of assessing quality on grasses. They still rely on that value because it has the most data behind it, is my understanding. At the same time, when you're getting your pasture samples back, and if you have NDF values that are high 60s to 70, that's pretty indigestible material, and you're not going to have a lot of intake there. So if your TDN values are in the high 60s to 70s, which based on stockpile, that's kind of where others have seen it. And your NDFs are low 60s, high 50s. That's quality pasture. I think you're going to see manure piles kind of not loose, but kind of that. Well, I'll just go back. I still have my slides pulled up. You're going to kind of be in this area, maybe a little less formation, but not nearly, the manure pile here on the left, which you described, or yes, the question, whenever you're turning those cattle out to in the spring, right? You're talking about washy grass. Maybe share with that a little bit, and then we can go from there.
What I've done, the cattle on that grass, on that manure pile on the left side there, they're going to be losing weight. And it's hard to understand, I should say it's hard for me to understand at first when I was advised to offer dry hay while they're on that time of year, while they're on that type of grass, because I thought that was going to be a waste of hay. They weren't going to touch it, and I'd just be throwing money away. And I put a round bale out in an area where I could access it from a couple different paddocks, and they didn't eat it fast, but they did come back and get some of that dry hay, and it helped. It was described, and you can speak to this better, but it was described to me as how they feel like they have diarrhea and they want something to slow things down, and that's the way we feel too. And so when we have that situation, and offering that, even though they got green grass there that they've been waiting for all winter, they're going to still, and you don't want junk hay, you want some kind of fairly decent quality hay, but dry hay, they will come back to it and kind of balance themselves if they have the opportunity. The other thing I did, was part of my question, was sometimes I've been able to, just because of the way my paddocks worked out and the way I never had enough stockpile to graze all the way through the winter, but I would sometimes keep a paddock or two to graze at that time of year, because it would have that old vegetation in there with the new growth. Yep. And that worked pretty good. And it was actually better than putting the hay out, because it was right there where they were grazing. But I think that is a valuable thing to recognize, that the cattle there's a period of time there in the spring where they're going to lose weight if you don't make a change.
Yep. You're spot on. And we actually, we've seen the same effect early in fall grazing, or coming back through. It's not stockpile yet. It's some, probably the paddocks are last grazing before we move into stockpile. But up here, this upper picture, I've seen pastures that look like this in September, late August, on well-managed pastures. And we see the same situation. And what's happening here, folks, is that you got to think about passage. It's, there's a lot of leaf material here. And so, essentially it's high 80 to 90% water. So their dry matter intake is low, because it's high quality feed, but there's a lot of water associated with that. And while water is a requirement, nutrients are delivered on the dry matter component. And so we have to be meeting the dry matter requirement for energy, protein, minerals, and such. And so you have a highly digestible forage source that is small particle. And so its rate of passage through the animal is quick. And so that's why, we essentially see diarrhea, or very, very, very loose stool. And Ted's exactly right. They are going to lose weight, especially if the animal is lactating because of the energy demands of lactation, or you have, so they'll be losing weight, and dependent upon the feed stuff that a stocker or a non-mature animal has been transitioned off of. If they've been transitioned off of a higher dry matter component or higher dry matter forage and then put onto the that regrowth, they're going to go backwards on you because they're just again, we're not meeting their dry matter requirement, and they're somewhat dehydrated because we're losing a lot of excreta. And so similar to Ted, at SciPac, Jason will go out and he'll flake out he utilizes large squares as a forage basis when he's not grazing, which is in previous years, and right now he's having to use stored feed for about 60 days out of the year. And so similar to you, Ted, he'll go out and flake that hay out. And what Ted said is very important, that harvested feed stuff needs to be, average to good quality, because otherwise they're going, if it's real stemmy, they're going to leave it. And at that point it's manure. And so I'm going to transition into the concept of bale grazing. That's kind of the conversation, right? And so I'm going to click through a couple of pictures here. So I think this is year 3 that Jason has started, or not started. He's in year 3 of utilizing bale grazing. And so the first year we tried it. Honestly, I didn't think it was going to work. I thought I saw too much hay waste. The problem was that the bale size did not match when a move needed to occur. So he's moving cattle every day to 2 days, and so based on the residual height of the forage and not causing too much pugging or compaction, the bales were oversized. So the following year, talked to the guy who buys hay off of it, and the downsized the bale size, and so essentially by putting that bale out there, it gained him an extra day. And whenever we made that change, I was really impressed by the minimal amount of waste. So hopefully you can see this. This is a picture of where a bale was sat without, we were using poly rings at that point. But there was no piling whatsoever. Very, very minimal waste. However, depending upon your soil type, this is, there's some pugging issues here around where that bale sat, especially if you get a moisture event on top of that. And so this year he's transitioned away from that, utilizing the bales, and has gone to an unroller. And again, folks, he's figuring that by putting that bale out there, it's gaining him an extra day on that from having to move cattle. And they're not, whenever he makes that move, he unrolls the bale. So, and they automatically line up and they go to eating. I don't have a picture here, but again, minimal waste. But it has to, that forage quality has to match the forage resource, the stockpile. Otherwise they're going to waste it.
I think the bale unrolling is a great thing. I tried to bale graze here, but my soil type is such that I was having more damage than I wanted to put up with and wasting more hay.
Yep.
But the unrolling, I think it'd be great.
And that's where, he's been working with Dr. Greg Halleck out of Kentucky on this idea. And like I said, I was not a believer that first year because there was way too much waste from an economical standpoint of some pretty high quality hay. And I was wrong. If you match the forage quality of that stored feed with that stockpiled fescue, you will have minimal waste, and it will extend your grazing season. The other thing you have to keep in mind is, like Ted, your soil, your soils, because we have some fragipan soils down at SciPac and Ag Center that I'm located at. And so we have some draining issues. And so we're actually grazing, probably bale grazing earlier in the fall when we're a little bit drier, so that we avoid some of that pugging if we're not unrolling. But like I said, going to the unrolling seems to be working well. At this point in time, I don't have any good solid structured research data to share with you. That would be a stay tuned plug for us in years to come.
You mentioned feeding hay earlier in the fall, bale grazing, and
Yep.
I learned a little bit trial and error, but I fed hay while the stockpile was developing in the fall a couple years, and given that stockpile a chance to be all it could be until the cold weather made it go dormant. And I was going to have to feed hay anyway. I knew I was going to run out, and it just made sense to get the most out of the forage that was trying to grow rather than graze it off and cut myself short that way.
Yep.
And I was happy with how that worked. It was, like I said, I was going to feed regardless, and I would feed, and I'm not talking about a long time, but maybe 3 or 4 weeks before the dormancy happened, which was usually for me was that first week of December, maybe Thanksgiving, but it was usually in December a little bit. And then I would graze the stockpile until it was used up, which I usually ran out about late February. And then I had another month or so to feed, before grass came in.
Right. No, I would agree with you. And that's probably a practice that's not being utilized enough in terms of feeding some stored feeds there in the late summer months, especially here in the Midwest, right? Because we're not getting a whole lot of growth quickly from our cool season grasses. And so when we think about the regenerative component or the health of the whole system, we don't want to cause any soil damage. And so anytime, whether it's pugging or damage from a tractor because we're going out and stirring up the, that topsoil, being on that field. Well, typically, late August, early September, typically it's dry, it's hot. And so the ground's firm. So you can go out and either pull the cows maybe off that pasture, allow it to rest and recover, or go out and like you said, bale graze in that situation, and still have to move cows relatively, every day or at least every 3 days. And that's can extend. It's like you said, you're going to have to probably feed stored forages at some point over the course of the year. And so why not avoid the mud and feed it early? I don't have a good method on how to encourage folks to do that more. I think it's probably they have to see it or they need to try it for a year or two and see how they get along to really become a good believer in it.
That's probably true because I didn't do it the first couple of years that I was stockpiling, and then I realized that I should have been probably. I could have kept more acres back for stockpile, and still, like I said, I was going to feed hay a certain amount of days regardless, and it worked out better. And it was. I don't know if you can if you can enjoy going out in the cold and snow and moving fence, but it was fun to me to watch those cattle and give them a fresh break every day. After a while, when we get ready to show that one slide I have of the cattle in one of those, that was about the 3rd year I think I was strip grazing, but they adapt to that so quickly. They're ready to move, and the way the fresh strip of forage controls their traffic really reduces the damage in the pasture. I was moving every day, and a couple times I moved more than once a day, but that was rare. That was in extreme muddy conditions or something. And at the same time, you still need to have a sacrifice area because at some point it's going to get just to where you don't want to ruin your pasture for a day or two of grazing. Better to pull them off.
Yep.
But Aaron, if you could show that, is this a good time to show that picture?
I think so.
The, well, this is a good picture. This is late December, right about the end of the year, if I recall. And, or maybe in January. And here's where the cattle were. This is what they're grazing. They're gonna, the ground, when they move on, the ground's gonna be still covered with plenty of residual. And that's gonna help it get started in the spring in good time. But you can see this is a cow calf herd that was mine, not the custom grazing heifers. And some of these are fall calving cows, and there was no supplement. That's a mineral feeder sitting there, but I wasn't giving them any other supplement there. The condition that you see is what they got from the forage. And so I was happy with how they were doing. I wouldn't really want them any fatter. Anyway, if you could switch to the other picture, Aaron. This is the one, you can't really see my fence, but looking over, you can kind of see where the tracks are for the cattle in the new strip. But I had just taken the fence down. There's my four-wheeler parked partway across the field. I would park there and walk back up to the far end and start rolling the wire up. And by the time I got to the four-wheeler, I could throw the posts I had under my arm on the four-wheeler and then roll up the rest of the fence. But the cattle move over and they graze right through the snow. At this point, they're not even coming in for water. They're getting enough water from the snow. And I've had them graze through quite a bit more snow than that, where the forage wasn't sticking out of the snow at all, but they knew it was there because of experience. And so that was good. It's a little more difficult when that warms up and the snow's melting and things get the topsoil gets pretty sloppy. And that's when I'm going to be watching pretty close to pull them in and feed a little hay for a couple days and let that surface water soak in or go away before I turn them back out. And that's the adaptive part of all this, is just being there and recognizing what you need to do. And it takes a little while. It took me a little while to figure out what I needed to do. Sometimes I made a couple messes and didn't want to do that. I wish this was a little better picture of the residual, but this was an older cell phone that didn't have near as good a camera as the ones now. But the traffic, though, the left side of the picture, as far as they have there, will look like the right side by the next day. And then they're going to get the next strip, which is, I was going from post to post, which was on my division fences, they're about 60 feet apart. And so they're getting about a 60-foot strip by about 800 feet across that paddock per day. And it took a little while to figure out how much they needed. I don't want to have them be hungry. I want them to have plenty. I mean, it is cold weather, and I want to keep them gaining and keep them doing well. And so I watch the gut fill and just kind of watch how they are. If they finish grazing and they got time to lay down and relax a while and chew their cud, now they're not always up looking for another bite because they're still hungry. I watch that, and like I said, watch the gut fill and then watch the residual, because I don't want them to graze too close. I want the ground to still be covered when they're finished. And taking maybe a little more than half the forage that's there on stockpile, but not much. I'd take half and leave half is good for this type. You would probably even take less than that if you were trying to finish some cattle, because you just want them to take the best of what's out there. But that wasn't my situation.
Now, would you agree, Ted, that, if, like you said, they're paying attention to their contentment, if they're not content, more than likely, I would say that they're going to be walking that fence pretty hard, trying to get to that next cut. And so I guess, in my opinion, while some of this might sound like, for those that are maybe considering getting into this, man, this is a lot of labor. I really don't. I would say probably not, because you're going to, over the course of a week, if you're around them a week, or 10 days, you're going to get a feel for how they're acting and pick up on small things. And you got to keep those in mind because, like I said, we don't have to make this more complex than what we need it to be, because they're going to tell you what they want. It's kind of like if if you're utilizing a dry lot, and just primarily feeding stored feed. If you're feeding low quality hay, they're probably going to be balling a little bit, or they're just stirred up. They're going to be walking. They're not going to be content. So it's no different. It's just they're out grazing.
Yeah, as far as the labor or the time, I didn't mean to interrupt. Sorry.
No, you're fine. You're fine.
That process of rolling up this fence, I'm using geared reels and step-in posts, and it's quick and easy. I roll it up and I put the next day's fence up for the following break, while at the same time I'm out there. And the whole thing, once I'm there in the pasture, it takes about 30 minutes to do that. But a lot of that time while I'm doing that, I'm also looking at the cattle, seeing who's doing what, or if everybody's, moving well, and how, if there's any problems, that I need to attend to. And so I feel like I need to do that with the cattle daily anyway, just because I don't want to get behind or be surprised with some problem. And so to me, it's not an extra issue, and I'm only starting a four-wheeler to do this. I'm not starting a tractor and a TMR and doing other things that I might be doing in the winter if I didn't have this stockpile.
Right. Yeah, and that's what I've had some producers or some producers here in the state that are doing some custom grazing. I'm thinking about your snowfall, and folks might be thinking, oh man, how am I going to graze on maybe some frozen, semi-frozen ground? If you're, I would say that most folks are kind of watching the weekly forecast. Getting back to that producer who works, off the farm. Well, he sets up his moves, the next week's moves on Sunday afternoon. That he does that even throughout the summer. And so what I would throw out there is, folks during the winter, if weather's coming, go ahead and set up a couple additional, strips of grass. I know that takes a little bit extra, the fencing, but, you can get out ahead of that and plan for that so that you can keep grazing and, might save yourself a little bit of time of having to, push and post into the ground. The other thing I will say is when you're utilizing strip grazing like this on those smaller strips like Ted set up, it's really efficient to capture body condition score during this time. And I would advise you to be there right when you move them. You want to be body condition scoring when they're not full. So in the morning time, prior to grazing, it's going to take a couple hours for rumen fermentation to get going, because after probably the first between hour 2 and hour 4 after their initial meal, you're going to see the rumen start to expand just because of fermentation. They got their heads down and they're walking that strip. If they're ready to be moved, you're going to be walking a lot more because they're going to be walking up and down that strip, has been my experience. Not as big of it. Well, it is kind of a big deal during the winter months because you have more layers on. You weren't hot until the beginning. Then you're hot. Now you're cold. So, and I'm speaking from experience. So I've hung coats on fence posts before. So, but anyway, I think that's just kind of my experiences there. I know you had one more question that I was thinking of here. In terms of how fast does the nutritional value of stockpiled forage deteriorate? So it depends on the forage species. And so what I've learned from the folks out of the University of Kentucky, if you have, a heavy legume base in that stockpile, you want to transition onto those heavier legume based paddocks quicker, just so you don't, lose more of that nutrient content in the leaf material. But in the grasses, really from December to through March, it's pretty minimal. Crude protein, not a whole lot. You're going to lose some energy, probably in the neighborhood of 8 to 10, maybe 11% from what you started with. It's just not a whole lot from what others have published. So start with those, like I said, start with your transition onto your more heavier legume based paddocks, and then transition into your grasses, and it's not going to deteriorate a great deal from what I've read. Obviously, if you're getting good utilization and if they're not trampling a lot down into the ground where they wouldn't be grazing it.
Yeah, that sounds good. Thanks. I wanted to mention too, I did get caught with extreme cold weather a couple times during the stockpile grazing, and you're right. You can watch. Oh, you're always watching the weather anyway, so then you can set things up ahead. And once or twice I had to use a masonry bit on a cordless drill to drill the pilot hole to get the posts in the ground. But I was happily surprised how the forage on the pasture keeps the soil from freezing. In pretty low temperatures. You can work with it better than I expected, really.
Yeah, that was one thing that I even found somewhat surprising, here once I started hanging out with Jason down there at SciPac and learning that system. Honestly, even on his he uses a lot of just the black, I don't know if it's 3/4 inch or 1/2 inch water line pipe going to various, portable water sources. Now he's got, over the years, there's been quite a bit of thatch built over that water line. But unless we get a cold snap for, probably a week long, or as long as it's not greater than a week, he typically doesn't have water lines freezing and breaking. Now, that's been his experience. Don't take that verbatim. I don't want folks having broken water lines and being upset with me because I said that. Maybe ease yourself into that component of it.
Well, if anybody could get away with it, it'd be Jason. I look forward to seeing him all the time at the Indiana programs.
Yeah.
Well, Ted and Nick, thank you for those insights and sharing that conversation. I don't mean to cut you guys off, but I want to make sure that we get some of the questions and the comments that we got from the audience addressed. So our first question is, could you please define pugging?
Yep. So pugging is when you have a lot of hoof impression within your pasture. I'm going to share my screen real quick and go back to that picture so I can point it out. If the person's listening, I apologize, but you have quite a bit of disturbance to the topsoil, where you're going to see quite a bit of, like I said, hoof impressions on top of the ground. So those cows or those calves are probably, cattle is going to be more damaging than smaller ruminants, but they could be sinking down a couple of inches or more. That's how I would define it.
Okay, thank you, Nick. We also have a comment on bale grazing. This person says, I didn't give consideration to matching hay and forage quality, but I generally use first cut hay for the purpose of biomass, fertility, and seed from hay being returned to the pasture. And I haven't worried so much about waste. That's the biomass for soil microbes in the spring.
Okay. So that's kind of a system. I'm not going to say that that's the wrong approach, because I'm trying to think of, there's more than just the there's quite a bit in terms of that operation. You're trying to add for soil microbes with the quote unquote hay waste. But from an economical standpoint, early on, depending upon what you might be paying for that hay or paying for it to be harvested on your property, if the hay is taken off after, the seed, the heads have gone to seed, that's pretty indigestible. And that might be an instance where you need potentially supplementation for both energy and protein if a lot of their nutrients are going. You're asking that hay to be the main source of forage during that time of the year. Ted, do you have anything to weigh in there?
If it's going to be a short period of time, I think there's something to be said. I mean, Alan Nation with the old Stockman Grass Farmer magazine talked about stockpiling forage on the cattle's backs. If they're in extra good condition, you can afford a little bit of that. That's not something it's probably good to talk about even, but because you don't want people to go too far, but you can afford to, you want to utilize the forage you have maybe, and that might be a best way to use it rather than sometime later. I'm just kind of making things up, but I do know that sometimes the cattle can be in extremely good condition and you can afford to let them backslide a little bit just to get to a better time.
You're exactly right, Ted. I don't disagree whatsoever. You need kind of the mobile feed bucket on their back. So as long as cows, mature cows aren't less than a body condition score 5, more than likely we're not going to be compromising performance. So if they're 6 and if that's the type of hay that you're feeding for 30 days, we need to know more about the genetic component of that cow herd to give you a good indicator, but that would be something to monitor. But Ted's right. You can utilize that excess condition to supplement some lower quality feedstuffs. He's absolutely right.
One more question from a strong but small woman. Do you guys have any tricks for unrolling a 4x5 bale that was set out for winter bale grazing?
I guess there's equipment for that. Greg Judy in Missouri sells a bale unroller. It's a little expensive, but people have made homemade ones, but doing it by hand or trying to push them around with a tractor to unroll them sometimes makes a big mess. So I have not done it. I should have let Nick take this first.
No. So Jason has so in terms of how he's unrolling hay right now, he purchased one of Greg Judy's unroller after a couple of years of using the rings or not a ring. Like Ted said, they have some 3-point unrollers that you can purchase for a tractor, or if you're even those that go in the back of the truck, those are going to be more pricey. I understand that. I'm going to throw safety in there in terms of you want to control that bale when you're going to unroll it, and keep in mind what it might be rolling into. If you can't control it, we don't want it rolling through fences. That's a quick way to make the person you're renting or leasing ground from or your neighbor really unhappy with you. Now, we ran a custom hay business for a period of time when I was younger, and I had to be really aware where I decide to open the gate, especially when you're baling in subdivisions on ground that hasn't been put on a house on yet. So take that in consideration before you just have control of that bale, some way to control
it. She added, ideally, she would love to try to avoid firing up the tractor again also.
Yeah. So, yeah, I don't know, Ted, if you have any pictures or links or info where folks have maybe made their own unroller versus Greg Judy's. I have myself not looked up into those.
No, I don't have any links handy, but I think if you search on YouTube for bale unrolling, there's probably some videos. I know there's Greg Judy's videos, but I know there's some other, or there should be some others as well. And they can be pretty simple. I mean, if you got a weld shop nearby and some scrap material, you could rig up something that would work for a smaller scale operation that wouldn't be too costly.
Right.
I have come across some women grazers on TikTok too, Jenny. You could check them out. They
That's
they post
awesome.
random
Thanks.
tips and tricks, they're tough women,
Yeah.
but there's only so much strength that some of us have.
I know, right? Just sheer physics. The fulcrum just isn't there. Yeah, right. It's like I want to set all the hay out at an appropriate time where I'm not making muck with my tractor. But then it's like, if I want to unroll it, then I got to make muck potentially with my tractor, because who knows what the weather's going to be when I turn them into it. So that's what I've been trying to think through, because this will be my first winter really trying to set that out in a planned way and move and rotate them through. Because I actually dairy, and so I've separated my dry cows and heifers, and I'm going to try that with them this year, so they won't have a permanent laying back. And so I'm going to try that on another field. But just thinking through, I would like to unroll it. It's a space that's on a little bit of an incline, so I can have a little bit of help from gravity. But just I hate driving the tractor all the way out there and tearing it up, every couple days.
Mhm.
Yeah, I would agree there, Jenny, and that's given that it's on an incline, a slight incline. In terms of the soil conditions, like down at SciPac, Jason's learned that, probably here at the end of December, he's not going to be able to get out there. He's utilizing a small UTV. He's not taking a tractor unroll. That's where in previous years, he was using those rings. And so that's where I'd say maybe, after this year, you might maybe bale graze a little bit earlier into the year when it's, the soil is a little bit firmer. You're not causing that disturbance. So, adapting, it might not go as it planned this year. You might have to utilize a ring from, like I said, the safety component of it. But I don't have any good advice on how to resolve that this year for you in terms of accomplishing and enrolling.
It looked like Margaret dropped in the chat that she's unrolled bales just by pushing them. Like a 4x5 bale is pretty doable. And then also that they've put a bale mover that the 4x4 can pull. And from my experience with, we have horses and we have fed round bales to like stalled horses, and we have unrolled them by hand, and like getting them started is usually the trickiest part. But again, if you have a hill where they can roll away, then that's totally something that I would not do. But
part
where
of
we
the
were
trick
doing
is
very
making
flat.
sure you've put the bale set on its side so that it'll like spiral out the correct way. Because if you don't have that, then it's going to be hard. But if it's going to start, if you've oriented it correctly, so it'll kind of cinnamon roll unspiral the correct direction. Usually you just pull off the outer few inches. If you can scooch it forward even just a little bit, you can stand on that bit of stuff you've pulled off, get yourself a bit of extra height and leverage, and just start pushing it over, and it'll just unroll, and then the momentum will keep it going.
Awesome. I appreciate all that.
Yeah, thank you. With that being said, it looks like we don't have any other additional questions, but if you do have any additional questions, you can email either me or Aaron, and we will contact the speakers and get a response from them. With that being said, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. We will share the webinar recording with you all by email shortly.
And don't forget, we've got, this is part 1 of our 6-part series. We look forward to talking about more topics and dabbling in and out from, year round and focusing a little on winter grazing, and got a winter workshop coming up at the beginning of March. So keep an eye out on our website about events, and look forward to seeing you all for future sessions.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.